Hello and welcome to the ISO IEC 17025 2017 Common Pitfalls Encountered by Labs Pursuing Accreditation. My name is Jason Leighton, Senior Consultant with Perry Johnson Consulting. In this brief presentation, we will go over the most common problems encountered by laboratories seeking accreditation. These errors occur during the implementation phase and throughout ongoing maintenance of the laboratory management system's lifecycle. Before we delve into the issues, let's go through a brief background of the ISO IEC 17025 2017 standard, commonly referred to as 17025, and the key steps to achieving an accreditation. So what is the 17025 standard? This standard is an international standard used by testing, calibration, and sampling labs throughout the world to demonstrate a structured, well-managed lab. The standard itself is a combination of the ISO 9001-2015 standard and the industry-specific requirements contained within the 17025 standard. The 9001 components represent the overall quality management aspects of maintaining a lab management system, while the 17025 components define the controls needed to operate a consistent quality laboratory. In order to obtain an accreditation, labs must be audited through third-party organizations known as accredited laboratory agencies. Let's now go through the key steps to obtaining this accreditation. In phase 1, labs begin by implementing their lab system. This includes key items like developing documents and methods, writing procedures, and training personnel. In phase 2, the labs complete full system internal audits of their implemented laboratory management system, utilizing competent auditors. Deficiencies noted through these internal audits are then addressed through corrective action systems. In phase 3, the labs are assessed by the third-party accreditation lab agency through on-site audits. These audits evaluate the effectiveness of the implemented system, and any deficiencies noted during these assessments must be addressed through corrective actions before accreditation will be granted. So what are the most common pitfalls that labs encounter when going for an accreditation? Let's review those now. Risk assessment is a crucial part of any good lab management system. Risk may present itself in numerous ways throughout a lab's operations, personnel, and systems. The standard has specific requirements for what types of risks must be evaluated and acted upon to maintain the integrity of the system. Without a well-defined and structured approach to evaluating and dealing with potential risks, labs ultimately fail to meet expectations. Confidentiality of the customer's proprietary information is of the utmost importance for an accredited lab. A tightly controlled system with full involvement of all personnel must be developed to ensure the protection of this information. Any subsequent release of information must follow specific criteria in order to protect the confidentiality. Lack of knowledge of personnel and insufficient system controls lead to errors in protection of information. A system cannot be run by just one individual, nor can it be effectively maintained without support from the top. Leadership involvement, direction, and decision-making is critical to the success of any lab system. Without strong support from the top, a lab system will ultimately fail. In order to ensure that all aspects of the lab system are being operated, maintained, and continually improved, the personnel within the lab must be competent. Competence within the standard includes a multitude of requirements. Lack of sufficient definition of competence, records to demonstrate competence, and failure to evaluate competence on an ongoing basis are some of the key failures of lab systems through implementation. A lab must remain an independent entity with control over its own system. Multiple potential outside sources can influence and/or pressure a lab to deviate from their established controls. This independence must be maintained in order to provide confidence in the lab. The lack of reviewing these potential sources of influence on a regular basis lead to independence concerns. This is particularly problematic when a lab is part of a larger organization that produces the products to be evaluated by the lab. In order to effectively implement and maintain a lab management system, there are a myriad of responsibilities needed, from the execution of activities to the management of these activities and to the evaluation of the effectiveness of the systems. In order to ensure that these are happening, the lab must define the personnel who possess the authority to execute this responsibility. In addition, there's a need for resources to be able to accomplish oversight of the system. Resources include software, hardware, equipment, personnel, and facilities. Lack of sufficient definition of authority, along with failure to allocate resources, lead to failed accreditations. The facility the activities are conducted in have conditions that must be met in order to provide confidence in results. These conditions must be defined, documented, controlled, and recorded. In the case of deviations from these conditions, countermeasures must be established to correct and fix those deviations. Labs who fail to evaluate all potential sources of influence, which can be extensive, ultimately cast doubt on the results. Labs need varying amounts of equipment and types of equipment in order to execute the lab activities. This includes measuring equipment, software, auxiliary apparatus, reference standards, reference materials, reagents, and consumables. All of the equipment must be maintained in order to ensure the proper functioning and continued accuracy of the equipment. Rigorous controls must be put in place to manage equipment. Without a well-defined, documented, and managed system, equipment fails to meet those expectations. Lack of records to support the equipment management system ultimately lead to audit failure. All work conducted in the labs must be traceable. In order for this to occur, there must be an unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to the measurement uncertainty. Throughout this chain, competent laboratories must be used for the calibrations and certified reference materials. Failure to effectively evaluate the laboratories will lead to failure to maintain this traceability. In addition, lack of record keeping of all phases of the chain cause failure to maintain traceability. Labs need external providers in order to be capable of executing the laboratory management system. These external providers are needed for both products and services. Labs must have documented and maintained systems for evaluation, monitoring of performance, and re-evaluation of these providers. Labs routinely fail to monitor performance and re-evaluate providers, including lack of record keeping associated to these activities. Any products and services provided must be validated to ensure they meet requirements. When customers contract with the labs to perform work, the labs must communicate to the customer their decision rule. In addition, the customer must understand the decision rule employed and agree to this decision rule. Labs regularly fail to adequately define the decision rule and rarely communicate and get agreement with the customer on this decision rule. Records of these contractual obligations and agreed upon activities must be maintained, and it's very common for labs to have inadequate records to demonstrate these activities have been completed. When labs perform sampling of substances, materials, or products for the work to be performed, a clearly defined and documented sampling plan must be developed. Sampling plans include a multitude of requirements in order to be compliant. In addition, the lab must maintain sufficient records of the sampling data that occurred. Labs struggle with the development of these sampling plans and regularly lack sufficient records to demonstrate compliance with sampling requirements. All activity conducted by a lab comes with a level of uncertainty. The standard requires labs to have documented uncertainty budgets established for all activities conducted by the laboratory. This includes all subsets of disciplines conducted by the laboratory, and uncertainty budgets must include very specific components that contribute to the overall uncertainty of measurement. This must also be done for all internal calibrations performed by the lab. Labs regularly fail to include all the required contribution components to uncertainty budgets, As well, labs often lack sufficient data to support the uncertainty budgets. The lab activities must be continuously evaluated to ensure validity of the results obtained. This includes monitoring of internal data, evaluating this data against predefined criteria, and actions taken when the results deviate from this criteria. In addition, labs must routinely participate in proficiency testing. This must be done according to predefined schedules and for all disciplines and subdisciplines contained within the scope of the accreditation. Labs experience problem in this area because of lack of a defined and managed internal tracking system. As well, failure to create schedules to ensure proficiency testing is conducted leads to deficiencies. All labs must have a laboratory information management system in order to meet requirements of the standard. This LIMS system must be established for collecting, processing, recording, reporting, storage, and retrieval of data. The LIMS system must be monitored and controlled according to specific requirements defined within the standard. In the case of the lab choosing to outsource the management of the LIMS system, control still must be maintained by that laboratory. Labs routinely fail to meet the requirements due to lack of controls applied over the system and failure to evaluate the control of outsourced managements of their LIMS. A lab must never be satisfied with the performance of its lab system as it is. The lab must always be looking for ways to improve activities. There are a variety of sources of information that must be evaluated to identify improvement projects. Labs who don't identify improvement opportunities and implement improvement projects fail to meet the expectations the standard lays out. In addition, customer feedback must be obtained. This cannot be an assumed principle. Passive approach to customer feedback and satisfaction is not sufficient. A proactive methodology is always required. Deficiencies will exist in all labs. These can come from varying sources. Labs must address deficiencies through corrective action systems. Without sufficient depth of investigation into the cause and causes of these deficiencies, labs will fail to develop systemic actions to eliminate the causes. The most common failures in lab systems is a superficial corrective action methodology. A structured approach is what's necessary. Internal auditing of the lab must be conducted both at the beginning of the implementation of the lab management system and continuously throughout the life of the system. These internal audits must be conducted according to defined schedules, covering both the requirements of the standard as well as the laboratory activities. Labs rarely have the personnel that are competent to be qualified as auditors. As well, labs regularly fail to audit all the requirements the standard has laid forth. Labs usually do not have personnel with the necessary skills, experience, and training in the standard to be able to implement the lab management system. In addition, labs generally lack the time needed to develop the necessary documentation and systems to create a compliance system. Fortunately, these pitfalls are not impossible to overcome. Perry Johnson Consulting has personnel who possess extensive experience, skills, and training in the standard as well as lab systems. Our qualified professional consultants have worked with numerous labs across the country, providing them with a variety of methods to help labs develop and implement the laboratory management system requirements. Working with Perry Johnson Consulting will ensure that your lab will have a compliant, effective lab management system in place in order to obtain an accreditation. Thank you for your time.